What is one thing that will ruin a game, no matter how much hype it has, no matter how dedicated a fan base it has, or even regardless of how interesting the game's concept looks? It's the one thing that doesn't discriminate between how big your game is or how small it is. It'll ruin them all alike, and that is game launch bugs. Now you might be thinking, there are plenty of games that have come back from disastrous launches. Cyberpunk 2077 had one of the worst launches in modern history. However, after years of dedication, the team have fixed it, and it now runs as it should have on launch. And whilst you could argue that the demanding nature of fans who had been waiting for the game for so many years may have had some sort of impact on how quickly the devs wanted to release the game and how broken they did release it, is kind of a moot point. Similar with Assassin's Creed Unity, with its missing faces on launch, and also No Man's Sky, which arguably probably had a worse launch because it didn't have certain features that it had promised. And whilst some games you can get over the minor bugs, whether it's a slightly exaggerated ragdoll physics or something as simple as some incorrect text, what a lot of players might not forgive people for is either game breaking or immersion breaking bugs. And what you should probably consider is that if you're an indie dev and you are bombarded with negative reviews on Steam straight from launch, it's going to be a lot harder to break out from the deep hole you've dug yourself, especially compared to these larger studios with dedicated fan bases that are willing to come back and give it another try and maybe even revoke their review and replace it with a positive one. You may be wondering, why isn't this a typical game development log that we usually do every week? And to be quite frank, it's because last week was, from a viewer's perspective, probably quite boring. It mainly consisted of hammering out as much artwork as we can, adding over 25 fish and objects within the week on my side of things, whilst James continued to get the multiplayer to a state that we were happy with. So we decided, instead of giving you a 2-minute video on all of that, we would delve deeper into the other thing that we did throughout the entire week, and that's testing. So the week started off with me and James testing multiplayer as usual. He got it to a place where it worked and all 4 players could join. All the animations worked, including the emojis, the catching, and also the fish catching. On top of this, there were no issues in terms of connecting. Everybody managed to get there and it all seemed to be working rather well. There was one slight problem, however. The game was incredibly laggy, and anytime you went to do an emoji, it was just about expiring by the time the game caught up, and it didn't really make sense to play multiplayer. So after some back and forth, we found out what the main issue was. It was essentially down to the frequency of requests we were sending. Whilst in a game like Helldivers, you might want to send regular requests to find out where the character is standing, where they're looking, where they're shooting, if they're doing any emotes, or if they're being flung through the sky. Our game doesn't necessarily need that many requests. All it needs to know is quite regularly whether or not a fish has been caught, an emoji has been sent, or whether they're in the process of catching. And at the same time, bigger games will use client-side prediction to preempt other players' moves, which again is not something that we would really need. However, it turns out what was essentially happening was that 3 requests were being sent for each player, whether or not they'd sent an emoji, whether or not they'd caught a fish, and whether or not they were still connected. So that was 12 requests every time as a round update for the server and the client. Now the further problem for this was that we had set this to every frame, and with the game running at 30 frames per second, that was 30 times 12 requests every second. This is 3,600 requests every second, which is understandably far more than a simple desktop fishing game needs, and probably far more than any game needs. So me and James looked at how we could simplify this, dialing it back and revamping how the requests were done, as well as just toning down how many were done so often. This would also bring down any costs that we might incur in future when it comes to multiplayer, as we'd be charged on a request basis, and depending on how many people play the game on launch and continuously play it in the multiplayer setting is going to affect how many requests are being sent every second around the globe. So we simplified it to 1 request per player and brought it down to on average once every second. This involved changing the 3 requests of whether or not an emoji had been sent, a catch had been made, and if they were still connected, to asking that within 1 request, simplifying it to asking essentially what the status of each player was. So when you catch a perch, your status will be perch, and then once that's sent through the internet, your client or your friend's client will now see that you've caught a perch, as their client has taken the information on board. But because of this massive overhaul, it meant dialing back on a few features, rolling back to an earlier update, and almost starting from scratch on the multiplayer, which James was very happy about. What we decided to do was test essentially after every feature was re-implemented. On top of this, we also tried testing it with 4 players every single time. Now, me, James, and our good friend Freddie Mercury were 3 of the regulars, and we've had 3 different people join us in 4th player slot. Whilst this wasn't necessarily intentional, this has helped us ask a few other questions as well. Yes, we managed to find out if there was any bugs that were, well, game breaking, meaning people couldn't couldn't join or they weren't seeing fish, and we had all of that information. But it's also given us an insight into different players, how they would price it, what they like about the game, whether certain design features might need changing, and just an overall understanding of what gamers think of our game, which is understandably extremely helpful. Now, if you're making a game and you haven't playtested it, it'll be worthwhile. Now, yes, that person playtesting might not be your target demographic, and you might be limited in who you can get to test your game, but having an understanding from people outside of your target audience isn't necessarily a problem either, because they still might like certain features and functions in your game, and then you know how to highlight it and either alter or market your game to fit a wider audience. One of our playtesters I wouldn't have thought would enjoy the game in a million years, but after 5 minutes they started screaming and cheering essentially about the different catches they were making in the game. The rest of us understandably just felt quite giddy that it was working and that we could all sit there and fish together. Quite cool. Now, the recent bug I've caught for playtesting, although bug might not be the perfect word to use given the topic, comes from a game that has done exceptionally well in terms of playtesting. When I originally saw content creators playing Half Sword, I simply thought that maybe they had gotten an early Steam key and that the game was coming out very soon, but that they'd got content creators to play it to build hype and interest in the game, and I thought that was really cool. However, after going to wishlist the game on Steam, what I found out was that they were actually running a public playtest. Now, I don't think I've actually seen or been there, at the very least, from an early enough perspective to playtest a game. So as soon as I saw it, I thought, why not apply? And within seconds it came back that I was immediately accepted to playtest the game. And then I immediately wanted to go and play the game. Now, whilst half of the content from that game can't be put on this video because of how gory it can be, unless I put the settings to a much nicer version, it still says something about the benefits of playtesting. Half Sword's playtest could only have been a few months, but I saw multiple content creators play it and also spent a fair whack of my own time playing it whilst it was still in its playtest. And the worst part is I didn't even find any game-breaking bugs, really. I know there was some issues in terms of double grabbing movement, but you shouldn't be grappling anyway, that's dirty. And I genuinely enjoyed the game. Now, I have no idea how far it's going to go, if there's going to be a story, open world, etc, etc. As far as I can tell, there isn't. But from what I've played so far, the combat alone is enticing enough to want to play the game. So I decided to follow on and see how successful their playtest was, as by this point we'd already decided that we wanted to do something of a similar nature for Strange Shores. And I saw that they have a Discord with over 100,000 members, all different people wanting to just talk about the game and support the development of it. So overall, I thought their playtest was extremely good, and then I later got very disheartened when I realised the playtest was over and it said unavailable. But I went to the store page and they had a demo up which had just added even more features. So overall, I think the competency of Half Sword Games really shows, given how many people are interested and have been willing to not only playtest their game, but to follow on and join their Discord server. So where does that leave us with Strange Shores, and what's next in the pipeline? We recently got 4-player multiplayer to a place that works perfectly. There's still 1 or 2 features that need to be re-implemented that should hopefully be done by the end of this week. Once those features are back in and the multiplayer is working effectively, we can start looking at running a playtest for our game. This will help us stress test the servers, make sure that the game is viable and also can withstand a decent chunk of people playing it, and it hopefully means that we've got a marketing avenue as well, and that if some content creators end up playtesting our game, we can reach an even wider audience than we already have. The only other feature to be added after the playtest would be the unlockable locations, which should be a nice and simple feature to implement, and that's where we're currently at. So hopefully some of the benefits of playtesting have come across in this video, and hopefully there's a good understanding of where we're at with Strange Shores. Now, if you want to help us playtest the game, if you want to be involved, then by all means join us in our Discord, which there's a link down below, or if you'd prefer to keep your server list nice and clean, subscribe on YouTube, follow us on TikTok, or join us on Reddit. Hell, you can even follow us on Steam if you like. Wherever is easiest for you to follow with the game, updates should be posted about Strange Shores development and what our playtest plans are. We also still have our competition ongoing. This is for different ideas for you to put fish into the game. So if you want 4 free copies of Strange Shores, then by all means send us your ideas, and hopefully you are one of the 3 lucky winners. And on top of that, you can then also hopefully playtest the game and make sure that it's something you want to play before you even activate those Steam keys. But needless to say, if you're making an indie game and you want to avoid as many issues on launch as possible and have as successful a launch as possible, playtest your games, either in a small setting or on a larger public scale, depending on what you're more comfortable with. I've been Ellis, and thank you for watching.